Some evidence is found too late. Some evidence is never looked for. Some evidence sits in a box for 30 years in the same building as the people supposed to find it. This is the Keddie cabin murders. There is a road in Plumas County, California. It runs east through a canyon cut by the Feather River, State Route 70. In places, the road and the railroad share the same shelf of rock. The river moves below them both. In spring, the canyon walls run dark with snowmelt. In early April, the pines still hold the last of the winter cold. The sky between them is the particular blue of altitude, clean, distant, indifferent. 6 miles west of the county seat of Quincy, there is a turnoff. A cluster of wooden cabins around a central lodge, tucked against the base of the mountain where the canyon opens. A railroad junction where 3 lines once met. The Keddie Y, the only place on the Western Pacific Line where you could turn a train around. Above the lodge, a sign was visible from the highway. It read Keddie Resort. In 1981, Keddie had a population of fewer than 60 people. It had been something once, a hotel, built in 1910 for passengers on the rail corridor between Salt Lake City and Oakland, a place people traveled to on purpose, to see the mountains. By 1980, that was gone. What remained was a collection of aging wooden cabins, offered at low rent to families who needed space and could not afford much else. Not a resort in any functional sense. A place. The kind of place that exists in the gaps between more connected geographies, where people land when other options have narrowed. There was a bar called the Back Door, a central lodge, a railroad maintenance building, and the cabins arranged in rows along the mountain's foot, close enough that you could hear your neighbor's television through the wall on a quiet night. The mountain pressed in from behind. The canyon held the road and the rail below. Keddie was a place you reached by deliberate choice or by necessity. It did not sit on the way to anywhere. The cabins were 15 feet apart in places. Residents knew each other's children by name. Doors went unlocked. People moved between households with the ease of those who had agreed, without saying so, to look after one another. In a community of 60 people 1 road in, the nearest town 6 miles away, proximity becomes its own kind of protection. Keddie in 1981 was the kind of place where that protection felt real, where a child who wanted to sleep at a friend's house needed only to cross a few feet of gravel. This is the world Glenna, known as Sue Sharp, moved her 5 children into in the fall of 1980. She had come from a long way. She was rebuilding something. She was partway through. The last ordinary detail. On the evening of April 11th, 1981, 12-year-old Tina Sharp was watching television at the Seabolt family's cabin, Cabin 27, next door, 15 feet from her own front door. At 9:30 that night, she asked what time it was. Then she walked home. Sue Sharp was born on March 29th, 1945, in Springfield, Massachusetts. She was 36 years old in the spring of 1981. She had 5 children. She had been in Northern California for less than 2 years. The marriage to James Sharp had ended in July of 1979. She separated from him in Connecticut, packed the children, and drove west. Her brother Don lived in Northern California. He was the closest thing to a support system she had outside the marriage. The trip was not a vacation, it was a reset, the kind undertaken by people who have exhausted other options and are betting on geography. They settled first in Quincy, a small trailer at the Claremont Trailer Village formerly occupied by Don, cramped, temporary. In the fall of 1980, a cabin at the Keddie Resort became available, Cabin 28, a 3-bedroom wooden structure, bigger than the trailer, set at the edge of the resort, with a back staircase descending to the lot below. The previous occupant had been the Plumas County Sheriff, Sylvester Douglas Thomas, who had vacated it before moving elsewhere in the county. Sue Sharp moved her family into the sheriff's old house. She had 5 children to house and no established income history in California. She worked part-time. She enrolled in typing classes at Feather River College in Quincy through the California Education Training Act, a federal program for displaced homemakers and low-income adults working towards self-sufficiency. She was in her mid-30s, learning a new skill set in a new state, 5 dependents, margins too thin to absorb much. The typing classes were not an indulgence. They were a strategy, the specific, unglamorous work of a woman who understood she needed to become more employable before she could become more stable. There is a detail in the record that deserves attention. When the Sharp family moved into cabin 28, teachers at the school in Quincy noted that the children seemed to have limited support at home. That was not a judgment on Sue Sharp's parenting. It was a description of her circumstances. A single mother, new to the state, working and studying at the same time, managing 5 children, ages 5 to 15, on a budget with no room for error. The absence of support at home was not a character failure. It was an arithmetic fact. She was one person doing the work of 3. What she had built in 6 months was this: a neighborhood. Children who knew each other's names across 15 feet of gravel, a front door that went unlocked because the community was small enough to function on trust. A place where Sheila could sleep next door at the Seabolts without a long goodbye because morning was just a few steps away. Her children ranged from 15 to 5. John was the oldest, 15, born November 16th, 1965. He was, by the accounts that survive him, a teenager with energy and attitude and a wide social radius, known in the area, not always liked by everyone, which is its own kind of presence. He hitchhiked to Quincy regularly, came home when he felt like it, tested the edges of what his mother would tolerate. His closest friend was Dana Wingate, 17, from Gansner Park in Quincy. Dana had a reputation as someone who could get into trouble. They were inseparable in the way of certain adolescent boys, each one amplifying the other. Mike Gamberg, a deputy with the Plumas County Sheriff's Office who knew the area and its people, would say, decades later, "Dana was at my house the day before the homicide." Sheila was 14. She had her mother's practicality, the particular self-possession of an oldest daughter in a struggling household. She was the one who left for a sleepover that Saturday night. She was the one who came home in the morning. Tina was 12, born July 22nd, 1968. By the slender details the record preserves, she liked to watch television. She came and went between the Seabolt's cabin and her own. She asked what time it was at 9:30 on a Saturday evening, and she walked home. Rick was 10. Greg was 5. The Sharp family had been in Keddie for less than 6 months when April arrived. The children had found their way into the community through proximity, through school, through the easy social flow of a place with 60 people. Cabin 28 was a home still in the process of becoming one. Keddie in the spring of 1981 was not idyllic. It was economically fragile, architecturally declining, its best years behind it. But for 60 people who had ended up there, it was a community. It had the texture of one. On the evening of April 11th, Sue Sharp was home with most of her children around her. Sheila was next door at the Seabolts. Tina had gone back home. There was nothing to mark the evening as anything other than ordinary. When Sheila crossed the gravel after 8 that night, she left without ceremony. "See you in the morning." April 11th had been unremarkable in its specifics. Around 11:30 that morning, Sue drove with Sheila and Greg to pick up Rick from baseball tryouts at Gansner Field in Quincy. On the way through the canyon, they came across John and Dana hitchhiking thumbs out, heading back toward Keddie. Sue stopped and gave them a ride, 6 miles home. It was the last documented moment when all of the people who would be dead by morning were together in an ordinary act. A mother driving her children home. Around 3:30 that afternoon, John and Dana hitched back to Quincy. They were seen in the downtown area that evening. They needed a ride home. Someone gave them one. The time of their return to cabin 28 is not precisely established, somewhere after 9 that night. Special investigator Mike Gamberg, who reopened the case 32 years later, identified the woman who drove them and interviewed her. Her identity has not been made public. At some point that evening, before the end came, those two boys were home. John and Dana were in the cabin. Sheila left for the Seabolts after 8. Tina came home from the Seabolts at 9:30. She had asked what time it was before she walked back. Justin Smart, 12 years old, stepson of Martin Smart, from cabin 26 was sleeping over with Rick and Greg. Cabin 26 was just a short walk from cabin 28. Justin had been brought over to spend the night. That same Saturday, Martin Smart, his friend John Bo Bubede, and Marilyn Smart spent part of the evening at Keddie's backdoor bar. The three arrived around 10 that night. Smart complained to the bartender about the music. It had been switched from country to rock. He didn't like it. He called the bar to complain. He and Bubade went back. At some point, they went home. Martin Smart was a Vietnam veteran. He had been treated at the VA for PTSD and anger management. He was known to have a volatile temperament. He had, by multiple accounts, a specific antagonism toward John Sharp, the 15-year-old whose personality and conflicts had created friction in the small community. Bubade had been staying with the Smarts for approximately 12 days. He was in his 50s. He had a criminal record. There were documented connections or alleged connections to organized crime in Chicago. At 1:15 in the morning, a couple in cabin 16, some distance down the resort from cabin 28, reported being awakened by what sounded like muffled screaming. They did not call anyone. They did not check. They went back to sleep. The sound stopped. At approximately 10 in the morning on Sunday, April 12th, 1981, Sheila Sharp walked back across the gravel from the Seabolts to cabin 28. She was going to change for church. She opened the front door. The three bodies were on the living room floor. She could not, at first, identify them. There was too much blood. She ran back to the Seabolts. In the rear bedroom, Rick and Greg and Justin Smart were alive and unhurt. They had been in that room throughout. Jamie Seabolt helped the three boys out through the side bedroom window so they would not have to walk through the living room. He then went back up the stairs and into the cabin himself to see, he later explained, whether anyone else was left alive. The resort co-owner, Jan Albin, called the Plumas County Sheriff's Office at 8:05 that morning. The first deputy, Hank Clement, arrived. Sue's brother Don Davis was reportedly at or near the scene at approximately the same time. Sheila had called him. The scene was not secured. The autopsy was conducted by the Sacramento County coroner several days after the murders. Its findings are part of the documented public record. Sue Sharp had been bound her wrists with medical tape. The coroner noted the binding was tighter than the others. She was nude from the waist down. She had been stabbed repeatedly in the chest and throat. The wound to the throat passed horizontally through her larynx and nicked the spine. There was an imprint on the side of her head consistent with the butt of a Daisy 880BB pellet rifle. Sue had defensive wounds. She had fought. John Sharp's throat was slashed. His skull had been fractured by repeated hammer blows. Dana Wingate had been struck in the head with a hammer repeatedly and manually strangled to death. All three had been bound with both medical tape and electrical cord. Their ankles had been secured, in some cases linked together. Stab marks were found in the walls of the living room. 2 knives were recovered. a bent steak knife on the floor, a butcher knife and a claw hammer, side by side, on a small table near the kitchen. A bloody fingerprint was found on the handrail of the exterior back staircase. No blood from any perpetrator was recovered. They had not been injured or not seriously enough to bleed. Most, investigators later concluded, had worn gloves. No identifiable footprints were recovered from inside the cabin. Investigators initially took several hours to understand that Tina was not in the house. There was no obvious wound site for her in the living room. The bloodstains on her bedroom sheets were small, consistent with someone taken from sleep, not attacked where she lay. The cabin's back door was open. The murders had required coordination. 3 people had been subdued simultaneously, or in close sequence. The force applied multiple weapons. The binding, the overkill pointed to at least 2 attackers, likely more. Justin Smart, the only child who could speak to what happened, gave accounts that contradicted themselves across interviews, that he had seen the men come in, that he had been dreaming, combinations of both. His descriptions became the basis for composite sketches of 2 unknown men. Those sketches were later determined to have been drawn by a civilian volunteer named Harlan Embry. He had no formal training in forensic art, no certification from any law enforcement agency. Why the department chose to use an amateur with access to both the FBI's and the DOJ's professional forensic artists has never been publicly explained. It was not explained at the time. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office was facing the most violent crime in the county's recorded history. It had no homicide unit. It employed no forensic specialist. It had no established protocols for processing a complex, multi-victim murder scene. These are not offered as excuses. They are the condition. They describe what a small, rural department in the Sierra Nevada in 1981 was. They describe the gap in which 4 people were placed when they needed protection. In 1981, Plumas County covered nearly 2,600 square miles of Sierra Nevada terrain. Its law enforcement was staffed and resourced for its usual demands: traffic stops, domestic disturbances, small town disputes, the occasional property crime. It was not built for this. No one had designed it to be. The murders at Keddie exceeded the jurisdiction's capacity. In such situations, the correct response is escalation to a qualified outside agency. What happened instead was that the outside agency arrived, and it was not qualified for this task, or it was qualified for a different task entirely. Sheriff Thomas made a call to Sacramento. The California Department of Justice responded on the morning of April 12th, the same day the bodies were found. Special Agents Harry Bradley and P.A. Krim arrived in Plumas County by helicopter. They were not from the Homicide Division. They were from the Organized Crime Unit. The speed of their arrival would later prompt questions that remain unanswered. Getting 2 agents from Sacramento to Plumas County by helicopter on a Sunday morning, within hours of a call, would require that Thomas had contacted Sacramento almost immediately after learning of the murders, perhaps before the crime scene had been fully documented, certainly before its full scope was understood. Gamberg, reviewing the timeline decades later, noted publicly that the logistics don't easily fit a routine escalation process. The decision to send organized crime agents rather than homicide agents has one plausible institutional explanation: Bobet Day. His background connections to Chicago organized crime, known aliases. A criminal record was either already known to the DOJ or discoverable within the first hours. If Bobet was a person of interest to organized crime investigators, or if he was being protected as an informant, then sending the organized crime unit rather than homicide would serve institutional purposes that had nothing to do with finding who killed Sue and John Sharp, Dana Wingate, and Tina Sharp. That is an allegation. It has not been proven. What is documented is the deployment itself and what followed from it. The scene by the time the DOJ agents arrived, had already been compromised. Jamie Seabolt had entered the cabin. Don Davis was reportedly present when the first deputy arrived. Other members of the small community had approached. Vehicles were noted by license plate number. No roadblock had been established. No perimeter set. No vehicles searched as they left. Gamberg stated in a 2018 interview with the Plumas News that Keddie was not immediately secured and that the department had no protocols at that scale for doing so. Bradley and Krim conducted interviews. Martin Smart was brought in on April 13th, 2 days after the murders. Bubaid was interviewed on April 14th. According to accounts from Crime Magazine, which reviewed the interview records in detail, the questioning was cursory. Bubaid told the agents that Marilyn Smart was his niece. She was not related to him. He said he had lived in Keddie for a month. He had been there 12 days. He said he had never met Sue Sharp. Marilyn Smart's own statement contradicted that directly. She told investigators that she, Marty, and Bo had stopped at Sue's cabin before going to the bar on the evening of the murders. These contradictions were recorded. They were not followed up. Marilyn also told investigators she had left Smart the day the murders were discovered. She told them he had a violent temper, that he had been abusive to her emotionally and physically. This information was in the file. It was not treated as significant. Smart was administered a polygraph on April 17th. He passed it. He later told a VA counselor that beating a polygraph was easy. "I was lying," he said, according to the counselor's account, "and they let me go." Bubaid departed Keddie on April 14th, the day of his interview. A man named Lake drove him to Reno to catch a bus. His departure was not impeded by law enforcement. Smart also left Keddie shortly after his interview. He drove to Reno. From Reno, he wrote a letter to Marilyn. The Sacramento Bee reported its contents in 2016, citing it as part of the evidence examined when the case was reopened. Smart wrote about the difficulties in their marriage, about what he had done to try to hold it together. The relevant passage, as reported: "I've paid the price of your love, and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives." The letter was known to law enforcement at the time. It was not admitted as evidence in any proceeding. When Gamberg reviewed the case files in 2013, he found it. In a 2016 interview, he stated publicly that it had been overlooked in the initial investigation. In May of 1981, approximately 1 month after the murders, Martin Smart arrived at his 7th therapy appointment at the Veterans Administration facility in Reno. He told his counselor he wanted to clear his conscience. According to the counselor's later account reported in detail by the Plumas News and corroborated by Gamberg, who interviewed the counselor, Smart stated that he had killed Sue Sharp and Tina. "I killed the woman and her daughter, but I didn't have anything to do with the boys." He explained, according to this account, why Tina had to be taken. She had witnessed everything. She had seen his face. She could not be left. The counselor understood that a therapist's duty of confidentiality does not extend to confessions of murder. He contacted the DOJ. He asked for Bradley and Krim, the agents on the case. They met with him. They heard what he had to say. They told him it was hearsay, not actionable, not evidence, a man's account of what another man had told him. There is no documented record of any follow-up. The determination hearsay closed was not reviewed by a supervisor. It was not escalated. It was not transmitted to the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. It was filed, and it stopped. Within 3 months of the murders, Sheriff Thomas resigned from the investigation. He took a position with the California Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training, a state law enforcement oversight body. Gamberg noted in interviews with the Plumas News that standard vetting for such a position would typically require considerably more than 6 weeks. The speed of Thomas's transition has never been explained. Thomas later said in a 1987 interview with the Feather River Bulletin that the case had no apparent motive, that any case without an apparent motive was the toughest to solve. He did not address why the confession letter had not been examined. He did not address why the organized crime unit had been sent instead of homicide. He did not address what he knew about the departures of Smart and Bubaid. The case continued. In the way of investigations stripped of their founding momentum, it chased other trails. In the early 1980s, following their arrest for other crimes, Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole were examined as possible suspects. They had traveled through Northern California in 1980. They were eliminated records placed both men in Jacksonville, Florida on April 14, 1981, 3 days after the Keddie murders. In 1996, a railroad drifter named Robert Silveria confessed to the killings. He was cleared. Records showed he had been in state custody for auto theft at the time. Each dead end cost time. Each dead end was time the evidence was aging. The bloody fingerprint on the exterior handrail was never matched. The physical evidence collected in 1981 was, at some later and undetermined point, partially compromised. Crime magazine, reporting on the case in detail, noted that some evidence had been destroyed by a roof leak at the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. The precise inventory of what was lost has never been made public. 3 years after the murders on April 11th, 1984, the exact third anniversary, a man named Ronald Pedrini was collecting bottles in the woods near Feather Falls in Butte County, roughly 62 miles from Keddie. He found a human skull and part of a mandible. Near the remains, a blue nylon jacket, a child's blanket, a pair of Levi's jeans with a missing back pocket, an empty surgical tape dispenser. Investigators initially considered the possibility that the remains might be those of a Native American person from a prior era. The discovery was announced publicly. On April 22, 1984, 11 days after the remains were found, and the anniversary of the Keddie murders, the Butte County Sheriff's Office received a phone call. A male voice. The transcript, later recovered, reads, "Hello. I was watching the news and they were talking about the skull they found at Feather Falls and they asked for any help." The dispatcher acknowledged him. "And I was just wondering if they thought of the murder up in Keddie, in Plumas County, a couple of years ago, where a 12-year-old girl was never found." The caller knew that a 12-year-old girl had gone missing from Keddie 3 years earlier. He knew the remains might be hers. He was calling on the anniversary of the murders. He called before dental records had been analyzed, before investigators had formally connected the remains to the Sharp case. The call was not documented. It was not forwarded to Plumas County. It was not preserved as a lead in any active file. A recording of the call was found at the bottom of an evidence box at the Plumas County Sheriff's Office in Quincy, not Butte County, at some point after 2013, when a deputy assigned to the reopened case went through the old boxes. 30 years after it was received. In June of 1984, forensic analysis of Tina Sharp's dental records confirmed what the anonymous caller had appeared to already know. The remains were hers. The case that had been a triple homicide was now a quadruple homicide. The cause of Tina's death could not be determined. Decomposition had been too extensive. Whatever happened to Tina Sharp between the back door of Cabin 28 and the woods near Feather Falls has never been established by any court or formal proceeding. Martin Smart died in the year 2000. He died of cancer. He died without being charged with anything connected to the Keddie murders. John Beau Bubaid died in 1988 in Chicago. He died free. Each of these deaths closed a door. The men whose names appeared in every serious account of what happened in Cabin 28 died without ever being required to answer for it in any formal proceeding. Their deaths did not resolve the case. They calcified it. They moved it from the category of prosecutable to the category of permanently incomplete. This is a specific kind of institutional failure, the failure of time. When a system loses the first weeks of an investigation, when it secures no perimeter, interviews suspects once and releases them, files a confession letter without reading it, it does not merely lose information. It loses the window in which the living can be compelled to account for what they did. The legal apparatus requires suspects to be alive. It requires evidence to be preserved. It requires chains of custody to be unbroken. What the first investigators chose not to do in April of 1981 did not simply delay justice. It consumed the conditions under which justice was possible. In 2004, Cabin 28 was condemned and demolished. Most of the remaining structures of the Keddie resort went with it. The physical site of the crime no longer exists. What had been Keddie Resort the cabins, the lodge, the railroad junction is now largely a vacant lot off State Route 70, marked by a single boarded building that drivers pass without stopping. The community of 60 people who had left their doors unlocked had long since dispersed. The Seabolts were gone. The lodge was closed. Keddie had been, in the years after the murders, a place where people stopped letting their children outside after dark, where doors that had never been locked were locked, where the social contract of proximity curdled into suspicion. It never recovered. Sheila Sharp left. She and Rick and Greg were sent back east to live with their father, the man their mother had separated from and driven across the country to leave behind. She carried what she had seen. She spoke publicly, when she spoke, with the specific cadence of a person who has been asking institutions for something for a very long time and has learned, through repetition, not to expect an answer. "I was told the suspects were told to get out of town," she told CBS Sacramento in 2016. "So, to me, that means it was covered up." That is not a legal finding. It is not a conclusion supportable in a courtroom. It is a woman who was 14 years old when she opened a front door on a Sunday morning and has spent more than 40 years since waiting for the agencies that should have answered to do so. In August of 2013, Greg Hagwood took office as Plumas County Sheriff. He had been 16 years old in the spring of 1981. He had known John Sharp and Dana Wingate, had worked alongside them both at the county fairgrounds the summer before the murders. He had grown up in the shadow of a case his predecessors had left disassembled and untouched. "For me, personally and professionally, it's been a dark cloud hanging over your shoulder," he said. "There is no expiration date on justice." He hired Mike Gamberg as special investigator. Gamberg had been a deputy in Plumas County in April of 1981. He had been fired in an unrelated dispute before the murders. Upon reinstatement, Thomas had kept him out of the investigation. He had watched the mishandling as a bystander with professional knowledge. He had leads in 1981 that Thomas ignored. He carried those leads for 30 years. "The case was really fragmented," Gamberg told a reporter in 2016. "I basically had to rebuild the case. And if the right things had been done, this thing would have been solved within weeks of the homicide." What he rebuilt it from deserves to be listed, because the list is itself an indictment. A confession letter from Martin Smart, written in Reno, days after the murders, known to law enforcement since 1981. Identified, unexamined, in the files. A sealed audio recording of an anonymous caller from April of 1984, received by the Butte County Sheriff's Office, transferred, somehow, to Plumas County's evidence room, found at the bottom of an old box, unopened. A recording that once played revealed a voice identifying a murdered child's remains before forensic science confirmed them. A strip of white medical tape, consistent with the binding used on the victims, found on the floor near Sue Sharp's body in April of 1981, collected as evidence, placed in an envelope, never submitted for DNA testing, in the evidence room for 32 years. Gamberg found all of it. He described the experience of rebuilding the case not as detective work, but as excavation, digging through the accumulated negligence of 3 decades to find what had always been there. "It's not what was done," he told the Sacramento Bee in 2016. Speaking of the original investigation, "It's what wasn't done." In 2016, Gamberg recovered a hammer from a pond near the entrance to Keddie. It matched the description of a claw hammer Smart had reported missing from his cabin in the days before the murders. Hagwood said publicly the location was not accidental. The hammer had been placed there deliberately. The pond sat at the entrance to the resort on the road anyone leaving Keddie would have driven past. Someone had stopped. Someone had put the hammer in the water. And there it had remained, rusting in the sediment, while the investigation above it sat in the same stasis. In 2016, the Sacramento Bee published the contents of Smart's letter. The FBI analyzed the recording of the anonymous 1984 caller for voice identification. The evidence, dormant for 3 decades, was now being processed by tools that had existed in some form since the 1990s, tools that no one had applied to it. In April of 2018, Gamberg announced that the DNA from the strip of medical tape had been matched to a known living suspect. The suspect's identity was not publicly disclosed. No arrest has followed. No charge has been filed. As of 2025, the case is officially unsolved. Hagwood has stated publicly that he believes up to 6 people were involved in the murders, in what was done with Tina, in the disposal of evidence, in whatever the full geography of that night was. "It's my belief that there were more than 2 people involved in the totality of the crime," he said. "The disposal of the evidence, the abduction of the little girl." Gamberg has said, speaking directly to whoever is still living who knows what happened, "They better batten down the hatches, because we're coming." The DNA match was announced in 2018. The living suspect has not been charged. The public record does not explain the gap between a declared match and the absence of a prosecution. That gap 6 years, then 7 is its own kind of document. It records either an ongoing investigation too delicate to disturb, or a system that has again reached the edge of what it can, or will, do. Here is what can be said with precision, without allegation, without inference. In 1981, Plumas County had approximately 17,000 residents across nearly 2,600 square miles of Sierra Nevada terrain. Its sheriff's department had no dedicated homicide unit. It employed no forensic specialist. It had no established protocol for processing a complex, multi-victim murder scene. These are structural facts, not criticisms of individuals. They describe what a rural county of that size, in that era, was, and was not. They describe the gap between what the crime required and what the county possessed. This structural gap exists in rural counties across the United States. It is not a relic of 1981. Studies of rural law enforcement capacity conducted in subsequent decades have documented persistent disparities in forensic resources, training requirements, and interagency coordination protocols between rural and metropolitan departments. The gap that existed in Plumas County in April of 1981 is the same gap that exists today in hundreds of rural jurisdictions. What happened in Keddie is not a historical curiosity. It is a case study in what that gap costs when the wrong crime falls into it. The appropriate response to that gap was to obtain immediate, qualified outside assistance. That is what the call to the California Department of Justice was designed to accomplish. What arrived was 2 agents from the Organized Crime Unit. Why organized crime rather than homicide has never been formally explained by the DOJ. The deployment decision was not subject to public review at the time. It has not been subject to independent review since. The agent's conduct in the case, the single interview with each suspect, the dismissal of the confession report, the absence of follow-up on documented contradictions was not reviewed by any oversight body. They produced no public accounting of their investigation. They left Plumas County, and the case remained. The California Department of Justice has never issued a formal statement addressing the failures documented by the case's subsequent investigators. That institutional silence is itself a document. The scene was not secured before it was compromised. The primary suspects were interviewed once each by agents from the wrong division and released within 2 days. A direct confession report was categorized as hearsay and closed without review. A letter containing a near-explicit admission was filed and not examined for 30 years. An audio recording identifying a murdered child's remains was received by law enforcement, not documented, and found at the bottom of a box 3 decades later. These were not isolated individual failures. They were the outputs of a specific system. A rural department without homicide capacity, ceding to a state agency with undisclosed institutional priorities, producing a record that protected no one it was supposed to protect. There is a word that appears repeatedly in the accounts of investigators who reopened this case: fragmented. Gamberg used it. Hagwood used it. They used it to describe the evidence, the files, the case architecture itself. But fragmentation is not simply disorganization. It is what deliberate or negligent inaction produces over time. Evidence that is not collected fragments, leads that are not followed fragment. A case not pursued aggressively in its first weeks does not simply stall. It breaks apart into pieces that can no longer be connected with the certainty a prosecution requires. The fragmentation Gamberg inherited in 2013 was not the result of time alone. Time accelerates fragmentation. It does not create it. The fragmentation was created in April of 1981 by choices that guaranteed it. What those choices cost cannot be recovered. The suspects most directly implicated died free. The physical site of the crime was demolished. The child who was taken has never had anyone formally held responsible for what was done to her. The record is full of what was not done. And that record is itself a form of testimony if anyone is still willing to read it. The people who paid the cost of that system were not abstractions. Sue Sharp was 36 years old. She had driven across the country to start over. She was taking typing classes. She was building something out of what she had, which was not much, but which was hers, and was real, and was in motion. She had defensive wounds. The autopsy recorded them. She fought. John Sharp was 15. He had spent the summer at the county fairgrounds. He hitched rides to Quincy in the afternoons. He came home. Dana Wingate was 70. He had been at Mike Gamberg's house the day before his death. He was, by Gamberg's account, a man who spent a decade working this case, a sweetheart of a kid. Tina Sharp was 12. She walked home from the neighbor's cabin at 9:30 on a Saturday night. She asked what time it was before she left. That question, "What time is it?" is the last ordinary thing the record preserves about her. She was carried out a back door. She was not found for 3 years. And Sheila Sharp was 14. She left for a sleepover on a Saturday evening. She came back in the morning to change for church. She has spent more than 40 years waiting for the institutions that were present at the beginning, the department, the state agency, the county, to do what they were supposed to do. She is still waiting. Tina Sharp's partial remains were found in the woods of Butte County on April 11th, 1984. 3 years to the day from when she was taken. Beside her skull, a blue nylon jacket, a child's blanket, a pair of Levi's with a missing back pocket, and an empty surgical tape dispenser. The tape was gone, all of it, every strip. Used for something somewhere, on some night that has never been formally accounted for. Whatever it was used for was never established by any investigative proceeding. The person who called the sheriff's office 11 days after the discovery, who knew Tina's name before the forensic pathologist confirmed it, who called on the anniversary, who knew that a 12-year-old from Keddie had never been found hung up without identifying himself. Nobody documented the call. It sat in a box. For 30 years in the evidence room of the Plumas County Sheriff's Office in Quincy, California, a recording existed of a person who knew what had happened to Tina Sharp. It sat there when the department changed sheriffs. It sat there when Cabin 28 was demolished in 2004. It sat there while Martin Smart died in 2000, and while Bo Bubaid had already been dead for 12 years. It sat there while Sheila Sharp gave interview after interview, decade after decade, to reporters who came asking about the case and found the same answer. Nothing resolved, nothing charged, no one held accountable. It was found by a deputy going through old boxes after 2013, 30 years after it was received, sealed, unheard. This is the fracture. Not the crime itself, violence occurs, and not all violence is preventable. Not the failure of a single department, a single sheriff, a single decision made in the first hours of April 12th. The fracture is structural. It is the system a rural county without homicide infrastructure, ceding a quadruple murder to a state agency with institutional interests that were never disclosed, receiving no qualified investigative response, producing no formal accountability for the outcome, and leaving evidence in boxes while the people who knew what happened lived their lives and died their deaths uninterrupted. The tape dispenser in the woods was empty. The tape had already served whatever purpose it was brought there to serve. The call that could have opened the case sat in the dark of an evidence room for 30 years in a building maintained by the same institution that was supposed to find out what happened, in a county 6 miles from where 4 people were killed, in a box that no one opened. That is not a mystery. That is a record. And records, unlike the people they document, do not decompose. Every case we cover here ends the same way, not with a verdict, not with a sentence, but with a name that deserves to be remembered longer than the headlines that carried it. If this story stayed with you, that matters. It means you were paying attention not just to what happened, but to how it was allowed to happen. If you found value in this documentary, a like and a subscription helps this channel continue doing exactly this, slowing down, going deeper, and refusing to let the institutional silences go unnamed. And if there's a case you believe deserves this kind of scrutiny, a fracture that hasn't been examined, leave it in the comments. We read them. They shape what comes next. Fracture lines. Where the system meets the truth it tried to file away.